Violence, torture and repression, a special report from inside Zimbabwe. Protesters tell us of terrifying abuse at the hands of President Mugabe's security forces.
They pointed two guns to me, two AK-47 guns.
As he blames international sanctions at the UN for the near collapse of his country.
Remove the illegal and unjustified sanctions against my country.
Also on News at 10 tonight, some very undiplomatic language aimed at Russia by the US after the Syrian convoy attacks.
The trucks and the food and the medicine just spontaneously combusted. Anybody here believe that?
Dead at 15, just one of the victims of a crisis in mental health care. And why the author of Warhorse thinks selection in schools is a policy destined for failure.
The teachers, the other children, all know you failed. And the word fail hits you like a dagger in your heart when you're that age.
This is ITV News at 10 with Raghi Omar.
Good evening. Watching the procession of world leaders take to the platform at the United Nations, it seems clear that even the most controversial members of that exclusive club are allowed to go unchallenged. This afternoon, we had the sight of President and pariah Robert Mugabe of Zimbabwe telling the world his country's problems were all the fault of sanctions imposed by Britain, Europe and the United States. But tonight, we have the real story from inside Zimbabwe, of continuing abuses, of poverty and of crackdowns by Mugabe's police force, with evidence of abduction and even torture of political opponents.
In Zimbabwe, years of pent-up anger have at last ignited. Protest after protest, the greatest challenge in a decade to the long reign of Robert Mugabe, whose security forces are in turn accused of brutality. Dozens of dissidents, it's claimed, abducted and tortured. The evidence we found lies in a Harare hospital, closely watched by police, yet we reached the bedside of one who survived his ordeal, but only just.
They pointed two guns to me, two AK-47 guns, and without me saying anything, I surrendered in my hands in the air, and then they did actually put me in a sack and then took me out of the house. And then when we reached the destination, they just took me outside the car, threw me on the ground, and then they started putting electrical shockers on my feet without saying anything. I think they did it for about 3 times. Then they started now asking questions.
And then the beatings began.
You could have died. Yeah. It's one of those things where actually I started praying the minute that they took me. I thought that was the last time that I was actually going to be seen by people.
Silvanos belongs to a new generation of protest leaders deemed dangerous enemies of the state.
But I think it's the 3rd time that it has happened now. And I don't see us slowing down or trying to find a rest, because we know that the end is near.
We don't need police clearance.
Yet they ignore their president's will to stay in power at their peril. This man's offence, apparently to try to hand flowers to riot police. They responded to his bouquet with batons.
They brutalized me, and left me for dead. I suffered most on my hand because I tried to protect my head.
3 weeks on, the wounds haven't healed, and his fury is rising.
He is a tyranny. He is a dictator. He is someone who has seen many people cry. He is someone who has made many people suffer. And because of that, look, he shouldn't at all be accorded any form of respect. He is just a person who should be possibly arrest him at the United Nations.
But instead, many opponents we spoke to have been forced into hiding. Yet the future might not be decided on the streets, but by an economic crisis. Long queues for cash show Zimbabwe can no longer pay its way. The government's solution, coming in weeks, is to print banknotes for the first time since they abandoned their own currency amid ruinous hyperinflation. At its peak, 100 trillion Zimbabwean dollars bought merely a weekly bus pass, and people had to carry huge wads of this stuff around.
But still, it was worthless because the shops were empty. Now, this is a nightmare that many here fear is soon to return.
The plan has triggered yet more angry demonstrations, and for ordinary Zimbabweans, despair.
This time around, the problems would be you would have the cash, the house full of cash, but no foodstuffs in the shops. That's the kind of feeling I have.
He hasn't worked full-time for 15 years. Unemployment here tops 90%.
Hand to mouth. Life is unbearable here.
Some now dare to believe change is coming, but not without a fight and not without cost.
Well, John is back in Johannesburg. John, I mean, Mugabe is the great survivor, and despite all opposition to him, it is rare to get into the country. People must be wondering if he's ever going to be unseated.
Yeah, there's a strange mixture of hope and fear in Harare at the moment, and a real sense of an economy and a country close to meltdown. Often it is tragic, occasionally it is almost comic. Let me explain, Raggy. While we were there, the main hospital in Harare had to cancel all non-emergency operations. Why? Because they have simply run out of money to buy essential drugs like painkillers. At the same time, the government there seemed more concerned about banning the use of their own national flag by the opposition, who have used it to great effect in recent weeks. So you get that real mixture of emotion, a hope that change is coming soon, a fear that what will come before that.
What about fear for him, and what, if any, are the key challenges in front of him politically?
Well, I think we saw today Robert Mugabe's increasing physical frailty. It is matched now for the first time, I think, by real political frailty. Three things have happened, Ruggie. First of all, the opposition, so long divided, has made a concerted effort to unite. At the same time, the ZANU-PF, Mugabe's ruling party, is hopelessly riven by very bitter factional infighting over the succession question. And thirdly, we have this new generation of highly educated young street protesters, the people who say they have now lost all fear of the regime. That fear, that boast rather, I think we have found is going to be put severely to the test in the coming weeks and months.
The picture in Zimbabwe. John Ray, back in Johannesburg. Thank you very much. Now, rarely in the UN Security Council have people witnessed the kind of barely concealed anger and disbelief that saw the United States and Russia trade bitter accusations over the latest violence in Syria today. Washington says it believes Russian warplanes were responsible for the bombing of a UN aid convoy on Monday night, and has said Moscow needs to come clean, with Secretary of State John Kerry warning of a moment of truth. Meanwhile, in Syria, the killing goes on.
While the superpowers point fingers at each other, it's back to the daily life and death struggle in rebel-held Aleppo. Emergency teams looking for and finding survivors of the latest Syrian government bombing raids. The ceasefire seems a distant memory here, though the causes of its breakdown have led to angry exchanges between the planet's most powerful nations and some very undiplomatic language.
I listened to my colleague from Russia, and I sort of felt a little bit like they're sort of in a parallel universe here. How can people go sit at a table with a regime that bombs hospitals and drops chlorine gas again and again and again and again and again and again?
America says Monday's attack on a UN aid convoy was unforgivable and almost certainly carried out by a Russian warplane. Kerry said Russia's latest explanation of it defied belief.
The trucks and the food and the medicine just spontaneously combusted. Anybody here believe that? I mean, this is not a joke.
Russia, though, has denied involvement in the attack, producing drone footage that appears to show a militia truck towing a mortar pulling up alongside the convoy. Russia's defense ministry has even stated that an American Predator drone was in the area, but stopped short of accusing the US. Foreign Minister Lavrov called for a full impartial inquiry before anyone is blamed for the loss of life. And while those who could possibly stop all this find reasons not to do so, the bombardment and the suffering it causes goes on. America is now calling for a ban on all plane movement over areas like Aleppo. Paul Davis, News at 10.
Treating any serious illness, physical or mental, is fraught with problems. Mistakes can happen. But a coroner said today that a teenage boy with mental health problems died at a major mental health hospital because of a series of failures. Chris Brennan was 15. He had a history of harming himself, yet the hospital in South London did not carry out a proper risk assessment nor have any plan in place for his care. As his distraught mother told us, it seemed like he had been left in a corner and forgotten about.
Chris's parents remember him as funny, kind and caring. But at 13, he began hearing voices in his head and started to self-harm, often swallowing objects. By the time he was 15, his parents were struggling to keep him safe at home and admitted him to a psychiatric unit. But he died in the place responsible for protecting his life.
We knew he didn't want to die. He had these plans for the future. He had a lot to look forward to.
You hear all too often about the most vulnerable in society, but surely a child with mental illness, they must be the most vulnerable.
Chris began to experience mental illness in 2012 and was involved with local child mental health services. 2 years later, after prolonged periods of self-harm, he was admitted to Bethlem Royal Hospital in South London. Despite being on a ward with around-the-clock care, Chris continued to harm himself and was taken to accident and emergency several times. 6 weeks after being admitted to the hospital, he swallowed the cap of a deodorant bottle and died of cardiac arrest.
The coroner found the number of self-harming incidents on the unit here desensitised staff and that a lack of risk assessment and up-to-date care plan contributed to Christopher's death. The hospital has since apologised to his family and reviewed its procedures, but Christopher is one of at least 11 children to have died on psychiatric units in England in the 4-year period up to and including his death.
It does prompt the need for an urgent review into mental health services across the country, as we know this is not an isolated case.
Chris's short life was troubled, but his parents now live with the pain that it shouldn't have ended when it did. Sally Lockwood, News at 10.
The treatment of mentally ill people like Chris was supposed to have been given a boost by David Cameron's government when he said the mental illness should be given the same priority as physical ailments. But now a committee of MPs say that objective does not look affordable or achievable without cutting back in other areas. And that appears to tally with what we've been hearing from viewers after our report last week about NHS rationing.
9-year-old Rishi has a great head for figures.
81 divided by 9 is 9.
Correct. But what doesn't add up is what's happened to his hospital appointments. His autism affects his speech and mobility as much as ever, but his care has been cut to a fraction of what it was.
It started with us having an appointment with a community paediatrician every 3 months. Then it went to every 6 months. Over the span of last 3 years, now it's gone to once a year, where they used to see about 300, 400 children per paediatrician per month. They were allocated that. That got doubled, and now it's been more than tripled.
But Rishi's mum was just one among many of you who got in touch to say you couldn't get the right care. One mum told us, "We've been told my son needs an Asperger's assessment. He self-harms and is suicidal. But the first available appointment is in December." Another viewer wrote, "After being discharged from a mental health hospital, the support workers either didn't turn up or cancelled appointments because of no staff. I recently took an overdose." And a third woman posted, "I've been forced to go private for an autism assessment. The NHS waiting list is more than 2 years." Every one of your stories adding weight to the findings of the Public Accounts Committee, which after scrutinising the figures can't see how the transformation of mental health care will be funded.
We're already seeing difficult decisions being made about rationing. So there's got to be a bigger national conversation about this, including around mental health treatment.
The Department of Health points out the committee also noted important progress has been made with additional funding for mental health and new waiting time targets. But remember, England's hospitals finished the last financial year with deficits of well over £3 billion. This year, the NHS needs to save £3 billion more. The figures and your stories revealing the growing gap between the services we want and the money available. Rachel Younger, News at 10.
Economic slowdown, not meltdown, was the message from an influential think tank today. Before the vote, the OECD provided some dire warnings of the cost of leaving the EU, leading to Brexit campaigners viewing it as part of Project Fear. Well, now it's done something of a U-turn, saying it sees the British economy growing this year. Our political editor, Robert Peston, is in Downing Street. Robert, what do you make of these findings by the OECD?
Well, one of the things that's crystal clear is that the bloke who used to live here at 11 Downing Street, George Osborne, the last Chancellor, was wrong when he said that Brexit would lead to immediate economic disaster. And there are two reasons for that. The Bank of England took emergency measures with a very ambitious package to help the banks keep lending and to cut the cost of borrowing. And also, frankly, British people didn't believe the Chancellor. That's one of the reasons they voted for Brexit. And it's another reason why they've kept on spending. And we are an economy massively dependent on spending by consumers, by you and me. However, that doesn't mean we can all breathe a sigh of relief and assume that Brexit will impose no costs on us. The OECD, and the OECD, let's be clear, is not alone in this, expects a sharp slowdown next year, growth of 1%, which is half of the rate of growth this year, and actually rather less than half of what we've been enjoying in the two previous years. So that is a significant cost if it materialises. But here's the big point. Right now, I have never really known a time of such great economic uncertainty. And the reason for that is we are massively dependent on the European Union's market, the single market. We have no idea what our future relationship with that market will be. We think we will learn a bit more in January. The Bank of England said today that big companies are already reducing investment and reducing their hiring intentions. But how bad the slowdown will be is anybody's guess. And that's a huge problem for the new incumbent of number 11, Philip Hammond, because he's got to come up with a statement in the autumn that gives us renewed confidence. And when I talk to ministers and officials, they say, my goodness, that's going to be a very difficult job, because like me, all they can see at the moment is fog.
Fog indeed. Robert in Downing Street, thank you very much indeed. Immigration into Britain isn't just a hot political issue here. It's fast becoming part of the French presidential campaign too. Today, Nicolas Sarkozy, who is hoping to win back his old job, visited Calais, the town hall rather than the migrant camp. He went there to spell out that Britain needed to do more to contain the migrant problem around Calais.
A presidential candidate was in Calais today, but you can see why he didn't visit the jungle. Even without Nicolas Sarkozy here to share his forthright views on the migrant crisis, the camp was seething with resentment.
Once again, tensions have boiled over here in the jungle. Tear gas is being fired by the police and stones are being thrown at them by the migrants.
Today's clashes were sparked by migrants trying to climb this fence onto the motorway, the police responding robustly, a show of strength from them as the political rhetoric is also getting tougher in France. Enter a former president who wants the job again.
Vous avez un message pour Theresa May aujourd'hui?
Nicolas Sarkozy brushing away questions from journalists as he ploughed through the press scrum, trying to remain composed.
Please.
Inside, he met Calais leaders who've heard promises before, but today they were hearing them from a man who might just be the leader of this country next spring.
Schengen doesn't exist anymore. The first decision is to re-establish systematic control on all our frontiers. Of the 11,000 people, we are going to look at all of those who are hoping to go to Britain, and we will ask the British to process them whether they want to or not.
Back at the jungle, aid workers greeted his plans sceptically, saying there's no easy fix.
Everybody is thinking about the short term, everybody in France. People have this idea of why do all the refugees want to come to the UK? They don't. It's a really small number coming here. There are so much more in other parts of Europe. The ones that come here come for good reasons. Over half of them have family in the UK.
Like Khalid Mansour from Sudan, but after months of trying to get into Britain, he's giving up. He's claiming asylum in France.
UK is not paradise. It is a country just like the others, no difference.
You're going to stay here?
I think it is, it is a good solution.
But most of his friends are still determined to come to Britain and escape the squalor of this camp. Processing their asylum claims here might stop them attacking lorries each night, but it might also attract thousands more to Calais. It's a dilemma that's left politicians grasping for short-term fixes like this. A new stretch of fence, unlikely to solve this crisis, but it might perhaps buy some time for a better long-term strategy. Dan Rivers, News at 10, Calais.
America has found itself once again caught up in a backlash of violence sparked by the shooting of a black man by police officers. This time it is North Carolina in the town of Charlotte. The place has erupted with attacks on police and roadblocks. The police say the man they shot was carrying a gun. His family say he was carrying a book.
This time, overnight, it was the city of Charlotte in North Carolina that was convulsed by widespread fury over the police shooting of an African American. Officers in riot gear tried to maintain some kind of control, but the protest spilled out onto the highway. The aftermath of the shooting was captured by the daughter of the victim, live streaming this footage on Facebook.
He in the damn car reading a book. Y'all run up on him because he black.
What happened is disputed. Police say Keith Scott had a weapon and was seen as a threat by undercover officers trying to arrest another man. His family say Scott was holding not a weapon, but a book, and his sister expressed her grief and outrage at the shooting.
He didn't have no gun. He wasn't messing with nobody. All they did, them jump out boys, them undercover detectives, they jumped out their truck. They said, hands up. He got a gun, he got a gun. Pow, 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 pow. That's it.
That looks like a bad dude, too. On Friday in Oklahoma, there was another disturbing incident filmed by police cameras. Terrence Crutcher was walking away from the police, his hands apparently up in the air.
Not for taser, I think.
Officers in the helicopter thought those on the ground might use a taser.
Field is sitting in with us tonight.
But instead, a white police officer opened fire and killed him. Even Donald Trump, who on the campaign trail has defended aggressive police tactics, said he was shocked the officer had used her weapon.
But to me, he looked like somebody that was doing what they were asking him to do. And this young officer, I don't know what she was thinking. I don't know what she was thinking, but I'm very, very troubled by that.
And Hillary Clinton said something must change in police culture.
We have 2 more names to add to a list of African Americans killed by police officers in these encounters. It's unbearable, and it needs to become intolerable.
Once more, relations between minorities and law enforcement are plummeting. Robert Moore, News at 10, Washington.
Now imagine turning back the clock to a world without antibiotics, where in extreme cases, an infected cut or graze could end up killing you. That's the doomsday vision behind an agreement at the UN to fight superbugs. The discovery of penicillin by Alexander Fleming in 1928 revolutionized healthcare, and by the 1940s, antibiotics were being mass-produced. It meant common yet deadly illnesses like tuberculosis and pneumonia were suddenly treatable. So too simple things like those infections in cuts or grazes. Millions of lives have been saved. In fact, too many to even estimate. But antibiotics are now being overused. In the first 10 years of this century, the number of doses administered went up by 36%, and bacteria are now resistant to many of the drugs. Worldwide, at least 700,000 people die every year from drug-resistant superbugs. That could rise to 10 million by 2050 unless new drugs are rapidly developed. Our science correspondent, Alok Jha, is here. Alok, we've been discussing this whole issue of superbugs for many years on this programme and, of course, elsewhere across the country. What's different now? What's happened that's changed?
Well, for many decades, it's been scientists and doctors who've led that conversation about how bad superbugs can be and the problems with antimicrobials. The things that happen today is that it's an economist who's put this onto the agenda. So the UN General Assembly is discussing this because Jim O'Neill, who was commissioned by the UK government a few years ago to look at this problem and put numbers on it, essentially. He's essentially come up with numbers like $100 trillion is what it will cost if we don't do anything about this by 2050. So like all politicians, economists are the people they listen to, like the Stern Review of Climate Change 10 years ago put climate change on the agenda for world governments. This will hopefully do the same for antimicrobial resistance.
But is it going to lead to anything more than another UN talking shop? I mean, what happens next in practical, concrete terms?
Well, time will tell, but today what's happened is that people have agreed, 193 countries have agreed to three things.
Which is huge.
Which is enormous. They've agreed to three things. One, more surveillance, so better use of antibiotics. We use these things too much, and we need to stop that. Number two, better education for healthcare workers and also for members of the public about what you can actually do with these things and what you can't, because that's an incredibly important part of restricting their use. And thirdly, incentives for pharmaceutical companies. I mean, they're the ones who are going to create the new antibiotics. And it was Jim O'Neill who came up with the idea of a several billion dollar budget to give prizes to companies like that. So hopefully that will be the thing that moves forward. It might take a decade or more, but it's on the global agenda and this is a global problem. That's what we need if you're going to solve it.
A step forward. Alok, thank you very much indeed. As one of our best-loved children's authors and a former teacher himself, Michael Morpurgo of Warhorse fame knows a thing or two about developing young minds. Now, in an interview with News at 10, he's put himself at odds with the latest government thinking about grammar schools in England. He's criticised selection at 11, saying failure is like a dagger in the heart for those like him who did not pass the 11+.
Early one morning, Jim woke up and saw an enormous plant growing outside his window.
Class 1D is gripped, simply listening and enjoying the story. But that love of books and learning is being destroyed in later years, says a former children's laureate. Michael Morpurgo says over-testing is to blame, putting young children under too much pressure and creating a sense of failure that as a young boy he experienced.
Well, I took the 11+ and I failed it. And everyone knows you failed it. You don't hide these things, you know. All the people around you, the teachers, the other children, all know you failed. And the word fail hits you like a dagger in your heart when you're that age. So you don't forget it. And I think what it does is it somehow sends you into a spiral that you simply can't get out of. The notion is that they have thought you to be stupid.
So selective education, grammar schools, for you, clearly not the way forward.
We've done it, it didn't work, and the Prime Minister shouldn't be doing it. You're doing a terrible thing to, if you like, the unity of this country. You're simply dividing people at the age of 11. Sure, later on, you absolutely have to provide an education where children can find their feet and their fulfillment in a way that suits the gifts that they got, but not at 11.
The government has announced plans to increase the number of grammar schools in England. And while the system of selecting pupils who pass the 11+ has long proved controversial, testing primary school children does have some merit, says this deputy head teacher.
It's really important, it's in fact crucial that children know at age 11 where they are, and I'd much rather that they failed in year 7 than in year 13, so that when they leave school they don't have qualifications.
Get him, said the giant fiercely. Can I hear that?
Get him!
These 7-year-olds for now are just happy to be read to. The challenges of formal tests and exams yet to come. Nina Nanar, News at 10 in southwest London.
That's it for tonight. Tom will be back here tomorrow, but